For years, I blamed the world for everything wrong in my life. Turns out, I was the problem all along, and that's the best news I ever heard. PAUSE, let it sink in. I know that sounds backwards. How can being the problem be good news? But here's what changed everything for me. A bitter man named Marcos stood in a cave and screamed his pain into the darkness. And when that pain came roaring back at him louder, meaner, amplified from every direction, he finally understood something that will change your life too. Your life is an echo chamber. Whatever you shout into it comes back to you. Always, without exception. Shout bitterness, bitterness surrounds you. Shout nothing ever works, nothing works. Shout everyone lets me down, everyone does. But here's the part nobody tells you, the part that sets you free. If you whisper something different, the echo changes too. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how one moment in a cave revealed a spiritual principle so powerful that it transformed a man who'd given up on life, and how the same principle, when lived perfectly by one person 2,000 years ago, can transform yours. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover isn't just psychology. It's not positive thinking. It's the fundamental law of how reality actually works. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. In today's episode, The Echo Chamber.
Subscribe now. Activate notifications.
Have you ever noticed that the people who complain the most seem to have the most to complain about? It's almost uncanny, isn't it? You know the type. Maybe it's a coworker, a family member, a neighbor, or maybe even someone you see when you look in the mirror. They wake up expecting the day to go wrong, and somehow, like clockwork, it does. The traffic is terrible. The weather is miserable. People are rude. The news is depressing. The government is corrupt. The world is falling apart. Something bad always follows. And if you listen to them long enough, you start to wonder, is the world really that bad? Or is there something else going on here? Maybe you've seen it in someone you know, a friend who can't seem to catch a break no matter how hard they try, a family member who seems perpetually followed by a dark cloud that just won't lift no matter where they go or what they do. You've probably tried to help them. You've offered advice, pointed out opportunities, tried to encourage them to see things differently. But nothing seems to work. They're stuck, trapped, convinced that this is just how life is, at least for them. Maybe you're the one who's tired of hoping, because hope has let you down too many times to count. Not just hear it with your ears, but really let it sink down into that place inside you where the truth lives. That place that knows, even when you don't want to admit it, when something is real and important and potentially life-changing. You're experiencing the world as you are. Just decide to be happy. As if it were that simple. As if you hadn't already tried that 100 times and found it didn't work. Table, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and you're just trying to make it through one more day without falling apart completely, when all of that is your reality. Someone telling you that it's all about your attitude feels dismissive. Insulting, even. Like if you were just stronger, smarter, more positive, more spiritual, more something, then your life wouldn't be such a mess. Like it's all your fault. Like you're choosing to suffer. Like you're doing this to yourself. What if I told you that understanding this principle, really understanding it, not just intellectually, but feeling it in your bones, experiencing it in your life, is actually the key that unlocks the prison door you didn't even know you were locked inside? What if the very thing that sounds like it's blaming you is actually the thing that empowers you? What if the truth that makes you angry at first is the truth that sets you free? Because here's the paradox that changes everything. The paradox you need to wrap your mind around if you want anything in your life to be different. You're not responsible for everything that's happened to you. Let me say that again, because it's important. You are not responsible for everything that's happened to you. You didn't choose your parents or your childhood or the opportunities you had or didn't have. You didn't ask for the hardships that came your way, the losses, the betrayals, the disappointments, the tragedies. You didn't deserve the pain you've experienced. You didn't bring it on yourself through some moral failing or lack of faith or insufficient positive thinking. Bad things happen to good people all the time, and it's not fair, and it's not right. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. You're responsible for the meaning you assign to them. You're responsible for where you direct your attention, what you focus on, what you magnify, what you minimize. You're responsible for what you expect to find when you wake up each morning and face another day. It's not one more thing to feel guilty about, one more way you're failing, one more expectation you can't meet. You have the ability to change your life by changing what you put into it. Whatever you say, whatever sounds you make, a cave takes those sounds and sends them back to you, but louder, amplified, multiplied, coming at you from every direction until you're surrounded by the sound you created. Pointlessness, louder than you sent it out, surrounding you, pressing in on you from every side, confirming everything you already believed, making it impossible to hear anything else, making it impossible to think anything else, making it impossible to be anything else. The cave is telling me the truth. It's just doing what caves do, taking the sound you make and bouncing it back at you, faithfully, neutrally, without judgment or agenda. It will echo back whatever you give it with perfect fidelity. Something like, "Thank you for this breath. Thank you for this moment. Thank you for the fact that I'm still here. Thank you for the chance to try again. Thank you for the possibility that something could change." It doesn't decide that some messages deserve to be echoed and others don't. It just reflects, always, perfectly, without exception. It doesn't analyze. It doesn't decide whether you deserve good things or bad things. It just reflects back what you put out, amplified, always, without exception. This is not about denying your pain or minimizing your struggles or slapping a fake smile on your face while you're dying inside. Loss is real. All of that is valid and true and deserves to be acknowledged. We create through our attention and our beliefs and our expectations. The very reality we're so sure is being imposed on us from outside. This is just New Age nonsense, spiritual bypassing, privileged people telling suffering people that their suffering is their own fault. If you could just decide to be happy and wealthy and healthy, and everything would fall into place, then everyone would make that decision and the world would be a very different place. It changes what opportunities you see and which ones you miss. It changes the quality of your relationships because people respond to the energy you bring to them. It changes your resilience, your creativity, your flexibility, your willingness to keep trying when things get hard. It's a true story about a real man, though I've changed his name and some details to protect his privacy. His name for our purposes is Marcos. He's not famous. He's not a guru or a spiritual teacher or a self-help expert. He's not special or exceptional or uniquely gifted. An ordinary life. Disappointments piled on top of disappointments until he couldn't see anything else. Couldn't remember a time when life had been different. Couldn't imagine a future where things might change. Possibility we're living in fantasy land, denying reality, choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. He thought he was brave for facing the darkness, strong for not giving in to false hope, realistic for expecting the worst. Something that happened in a cave on a mountain on an autumn day when Marcos was dragged out of his comfortable misery by a friend who refused to give up on him. Up every morning with that weight on your chest, wondering why life has to be so hard, why you can't catch a break, why everyone else seems to have it easier, then you need to understand the echo chamber principle. It's not being unfair or cruel or arbitrary. It just means you can't see it anymore, which doesn't actually solve anything. It's going to ask you to consider the possibility that you've been wrong about some fundamental things. It's going to invite you to take responsibility for your life in a way that might feel overwhelming at first. It's easier to reject the teaching than to do the hard work of applying it. Fundamentally, might need to change first, but the real hard one, tested in the fire of freedom, of knowing that you have power over your own experience, that you're not at the mercy of circumstances, that you can choose what kind of life you're going to create by choosing what you're going to reflect into the mirror of existence. That's the miracle you're participating in right now. The miracle you've maybe stopped noticing because you've been too busy cataloging everything that's wrong. But open it just enough to let this possibility in. Then you can create a different one. While we reflect on this, write in the comments which city and country you're joining us from as you listen to this daily light message. We would love to know how far our message is reaching. His name was Marcos, and if you had crossed paths with him 5 years before this story begins, you would have seen a man who carried bitterness the way some people carry a briefcase, like it was part of his daily uniform, heavy and impossible to set down, something he'd grown so accustomed to carrying that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to walk through the world without that weight dragging him down. Those places where the American dream had been promised but never quite delivered. The building was old, built sometime in the 1970s, when construction was cheap and corners were cut, and nobody thought much about insulation or soundproofing or any of the things that make a place feel like a home rather than just a box to sleep in. Neighbors argued through walls, so thin you could hear every word. Dogs barked, babies cried, music thumped from the apartment below, bass lines vibrating up through the floor. The noise was constant, relentless, a reminder that the world kept moving forward, kept living and breathing and going about its business, while Marcus's own life seemed stuck in place, frozen, like a record player with a broken needle playing the same sad song over and over and over again. It was supposed to be temporary, just a place to get back on his feet, catch his breath, regroup before finding something better. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you stop believing things can change. And 7 years later, he was still there, still in the same small space with the same problems, only bigger now, more entrenched, more insurmountable. The living room doubled as dining room and office, a multi-purpose space that never quite succeeded at any of its purposes. The kitchen was a narrow galley with appliances that had seen better days, a refrigerator that hummed too loud, a stove with burners that didn't always light, a dishwasher that hadn't worked in 3 years that he used as extra storage. He didn't come into this world with a frown carved into his face, or with cynicism running through his veins like blood. He wasn't genetically predisposed to negativity. He wasn't cursed. He wasn't fundamentally broken or defective, or damaged beyond repair. If you'd known that younger Marcos, you wouldn't recognize the man he'd become. They were that different. His laughter used to fill rooms, loud and uninhibited and contagious. The kind of laughter that makes other people laugh, even if they hadn't heard the joke, just because joy is infectious, and his joy used to be abundant. Write and play by the rules. Real dreams, not the vague wishes of someone who's given up, but the concrete, specific, worked-out plans of someone who believes in the future. He was going to build a career he was proud of, something that made a difference, that mattered. He was going to find a partner he could grow old with, someone to share the journey with. He was going to have a family, watch his kids grow up, be the kind of father his own father hadn't quite managed to be. He was going to own a house, a real house with a yard and a garage and enough space for people to breathe. He was going to save money, retire comfortably, travel, see the world, live a life rich with experience and connection and meaning. Just a good, solid, middle-class American life. It's a gradual process, so slow you don't even notice it happening, like watching a photograph fade in the sunlight. Day by day, the colors drain away just a little bit more, so gradually that you don't see the change from one day to the next. But if you look at where you started and where you ended up, the difference is stark. The vibrant image has become a ghost of what it used to be. Marcos had worked for a manufacturing company, a good company that made quality products and treated its employees decently. He'd started there right out of high school, worked his way up from the factory floor to a supervisory position. He was good at his job, reliable, hardworking, the kind of employee companies say they value. He'd worked overtime when they needed him. He'd taken on extra responsibilities without asking for more pay. He'd been loyal, and his reward for that loyalty was a severance package that wouldn't last 6 months and a handshake from a boss who couldn't look him in the eye. At least he wasn't unemployed. The college degree he'd finally finished at night school, while working full-time didn't open the doors he'd been told it would. The networking he'd been advised to do felt like begging. The interviews where he was told he was overqualified, or not quite the right fit, or we're going in a different direction, piled up until the rejection became white noise, background radiation he'd learned to live with. The relationship he'd thought would last forever ended when his wife decided she needed to find herself, and found herself with someone who had a more stable career and better prospects. The second marriage lasted even less time, ending over arguments about money and stress and the general heaviness of trying to build a life together when everything kept falling apart. Their lives filled up with other things. The invitations came less frequently. The calls were further apart. Eventually, they stopped altogether, and Marcos told himself he didn't care, that he was better off alone anyway, that people always let you down in the end, so why bother? The relationships that crumbled like old bread left him more cautious, more guarded, less willing to risk his heart again. The house he'd wanted to buy became permanently out of reach as housing prices soared and his earnings stagnated. The retirement he'd imagined became a joke. How do you save for retirement when you can barely make rent? And with each disappointment, each failure, each promise broken and dream deferred and expectation unmet, a little bit more of that hopeful young man died. A little bit more of the light went out. A little bit more of the color faded from the photograph. It wasn't a physical weight. There was nothing there you could touch or see. No actual stone or brick or sandbag resting on his sternum. But it felt just as real, just as heavy, just as crushing. Maybe more so, because at least a physical weight you could remove. This weight was internal, immaterial, impossible to dislodge. The heavy certainty that another day was stretching out ahead of him. Another 24 hours where nothing would change, nothing would improve, nothing would surprise him, except maybe in the worst ways possible. Another day of going through the motions. Another day of pretending to care. Another day of existing without really living. Him, the heavy tread of the man who worked construction and left at 5 in the morning. Pipes clanging as someone turned on a shower. Muffled conversations through the walls. Words indistinct, but tones clear. Someone arguing, someone laughing, someone just talking. Normal people living normal lives. An acknowledgement that another day had arrived and he had to face it whether he wanted to or not. His body knew the routine so well his mind could be elsewhere, replaying old grievances, rehearsing imagined arguments, cataloging disappointments. Finally drag himself out of bed, the act of sitting up and swinging his legs to the floor requiring a level of willpower that felt disproportionate to such a simple action. Shuffle to the kitchen in his worn slippers, the ones with the hole forming near the left toe that he kept meaning to replace, but never did, because what was the point? They still worked mostly, and new slippers cost money, and money was always tight, and there were more important things to spend it on. And besides, he'd just wear out the new ones too, so why bother? Make coffee in the same chipped mug he'd been using for years, the one with the faded logo from a company he used to work. For before they let him go, before they decided his 15 years of loyalty and hard work were less important than their quarterly earnings report. He kept using the mug partly because it was convenient, partly because buying a new one seemed wasteful, but mostly, if he was honest with himself, which he tried not to be, as a form of self-punishment, a daily reminder of how he'd been discarded, how little his effort had mattered, how the promises they'd made had turned out to be lies. Then the others, he'd meant to fix that, had thought about it many times, had even bought the little felt pads you're supposed to stick under furniture legs to level them out. But they were still in the package in the junk drawer, and the table still wobbled, and he'd gotten used to it, learned to compensate, to keep his weight balanced, to not lean too heavily on the broken side. A metaphor, maybe, for his whole life learning to live with broken things, adjusting to dysfunction, accepting what should be unacceptable because fixing it seemed like too much effort. Wonder, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, why his life had turned out this way, what he'd done wrong, where he'd made the mistake that had set him on this path, whether there'd been a moment, a decision point, where if he'd chosen differently, everything would have been okay. He told himself he liked it that way, preferred it strong and black, but the truth was darker and more complicated. The bitter taste matched the bitter thoughts running laps through his mind like prisoners in an exercise yard, going around and around the same track, the same circuit, never escaping, never changing, just endlessly repeating the same route until the path was worn down to bedrock. With Interstate, the coffee tasted the way his life felt. There was an honesty in that, a refusal to pretend things were better than they were. Everyone else was adding sugar to their lives, sweetening the reality, covering up the bitterness with artificial flavoring. At least Marcos was facing the truth. At least he wasn't lying to himself. The list was long and well-rehearsed, each item polished smooth by repeated handling, each disappointment lovingly maintained, carefully preserved, regularly reviewed. The apartment he couldn't afford to move out of, even though he hated it, hated the noise and the thin walls and the neighbors and the whole run-down building with its broken elevator and flickering hallway lights and that smell in the stairwell that no amount of cleaning ever quite eliminated. Later with a different problem, like the universe was mocking him, like some cosmic force was specifically targeting him for punishment. He knew they talked about him when he wasn't around, probably saying things like, "Poor Marcos, he just can't seem to get it together," or "I've tried to help, but he won't listen," or "He's his own worst enemy." And they were probably right, but that didn't make it hurt any less, didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. The relationships that had failed because he couldn't trust, couldn't be vulnerable, couldn't believe that anyone would stay once they really knew him. The dreams he'd stopped dreaming because dreaming hurt too much and the dreams never came true. I worked hard. I did everything they told me to do. I played by the rules. I showed up. I tried. And where did it get me? Nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. Worse than nowhere. Going backwards. What if this is as good as it gets? What if you've already lived the best years of your life and didn't even know it at the time, and now it's just this, just existing, just surviving, just marking time until you die? That question was too big to face directly, too painful to examine in full light. So Marcos kept it in the shadows, ignored it, pretended it wasn't there, covered it up with anger and blame and 1,000 small resentments that were easier to feel than that deep existential dread. It colored everything he saw, tinted every interaction, filtered every experience through a lens of negativity so thick and so dark that even sunshine looked gray to him. Even laughter sounded hollow. Even beauty seemed ugly once he looked at it long enough to find the flaw. He tried to stand up, in kicking him when he was already down, in making sure he stayed exactly where he was, because God forbid anyone should actually get ahead or find happiness or experience success. He would see a couple holding hands and think, just wait, give it time. The honeymoon will end. Reality will set in. They'll end up disappointed like everyone else, like me, like everyone who's ever been stupid enough to believe in love. Everyone was just performing, just putting on a show, just pretending to be nicer than they actually were. If he actually told them how he was doing, if he was honest about the crushing weight of existence, about the grinding tedium of his days, about the loneliness that ate at him like acid, they'd be horrified. They'd make an excuse and leave. They didn't really want to know. Nobody really wanted to know. Marcos had to eat, of course, had to maintain the basic functions of existence, even when existence felt pointless, so he couldn't avoid it entirely. But every trip felt like running a gauntlet, like crossing a battlefield, like entering enemy territory, where he was surrounded on all sides by people who had their acts together, who knew what they were doing, who weren't barely holding on by their fingernails. He would stand in the aisles, calculator app open on his phone, mentally tallying every item with a growing sense of panic and resentment, feeling his jaw clench tighter with each addition to the cart. Highway robbery, he would mutter under his breath, loud enough for other shoppers to hear, wanting them to validate his anger, to agree with him, to confirm that yes, this is outrageous, this is unfair, this is the system grinding us down. They're bleeding us dry, and we just take it. We just accept it. We just bend over and say thank you. He would scrutinize every scanned item like a detective looking for evidence, double-check the receipt before he even left the register. And if there was a mistake, even a small one, even an honest error that could happen to anyone, he would pounce on it with an almost gleeful vindication. Can't trust anyone these days. Everyone's out to get what they can. You have to watch every single thing, or they'll rip you off. You can't let your guard down for a second. His suspicion had been justified. His vigilance had paid off. It was a hollow victory, like winning a game that nobody else knew they were playing, like scoring points that didn't matter, like being crowned king of a trash heap. Better, it was all the same, all garbage, all mindless entertainment from mindless people who didn't want to think about how bad things really were. And Marcos would nod along with each story, his worldview confirmed with every tragedy reported, every injustice documented, every failure of human decency displayed in high definition. And there's nothing anyone can do about it. He wasn't just a neutral observer documenting reality from a place of clear-eyed objectivity. Every negative expectation was like sunshine warming the ground, helping those seeds of bitterness sprout and grow and spread until they took over the entire garden of his life, choking out anything else that might have tried to grow there, dominating the landscape until that's all there was, just bitterness growing on bitterness, feeding on itself, creating more of itself in an endless cycle of negativity. When you wake up expecting the day to be terrible, what happens? Your brain, which is extraordinarily efficient at finding patterns and confirming beliefs, immediately goes to work finding evidence to support your expectation. The email that does come, but says the wrong thing. The price increase, the bad news, the disappointment. The fact that most drivers didn't cut you off. The fact that most clerks were neutral or even friendly. The fact that you received messages from people thinking of you. The fact that prices on some things stayed the same or even went down. The fact that some news was neutral or even good. The fact that some expectations were met or exceeded. It's just the way the human brain works, the way evolution designed us to function. We see what we're looking for. We find what we expect to find. We create self-fulfilling prophecies with every expectation we hold. A driver who was distracted and didn't see him became someone who cut him off on purpose, who didn't care about anyone but themselves, who represented everything wrong with society today. Why waste time on an activity that probably wouldn't be fun? Why go somewhere new when new places were just like old places, just different scenery surrounding the same fundamental disappointment? He expected failure, so he stopped putting in real effort, which of course led to more failure, which confirmed his belief that effort was pointless, which made him stop trying even harder, round and round in a vicious circle that tightened like a noose with each rotation, cutting off his air supply bit by bit until he could barely breathe, barely function, barely remember what it felt like to try, to hope, to believe that effort might actually lead somewhere good. Maybe never. His negativity like plants trying to grow under a heavy tarp that blocked out all the light. They couldn't thrive. They could barely survive. And eventually, most of them gave up entirely and gave her a stable life that looked nothing like Marcus's chaos. They had 2 kids, teenagers now, almost adults, and lived in a suburb about 40 miles away in a house with a yard and a 2-car garage and all the trappings of middle-class success that Marcos had once believed would be his too. Anymore. The phone would ring and Marcos would look at it, knowing who it was without checking, feeling that familiar mixture of obligation and resentment. Obligation, because she was his sister and she was trying. Resentment, because her trying felt like pity, like charity, like she was the successful one reaching down to help the failure. Like some pathetic, lonely person with nothing better to do, even though that's exactly what he'd been doing. She was the only person who still called him Marco, his childhood nickname, a remnant of a time when they'd been allies against the world, partners in surviving their father's moods and their mother's anxiety. "How are you doing?" And Marcos would launch into his litany of complaints like a priest beginning a familiar sermon, reciting from the gospel of grievance that he knew by heart and never tired of preaching, even though his congregation of 1 was clearly tired of hearing it. Flickered, and that smell in the stairwell was getting worse. It was criminal, really, charging more money for the same terrible conditions. But what could he do? Move? Where? Everything else was just as expensive or more, and moving cost money he didn't have. And it was all just a racket, all just a system designed to keep people like him trapped. The family upstairs, the ones with the heavy footsteps, they were starting earlier and ending later, stomping around at all hours like they were trying to drive him insane. And the music from downstairs, that constant bass thumping, didn't they have jobs? Didn't they sleep? Didn't they have any consideration for other people? The government was corrupt. Obviously, all politicians were the same. It didn't matter who you voted for, because they were all bought and paid for by corporations and special interests, and nobody cared about regular people anymore. The whole system was rigged. Democracy was a joke. Freedom was an illusion. We were all just slaves pretending to be free. Wet or too dry, never just right, never pleasant. And wasn't that just perfect? Even the weather was against him. It was all a scam. Would try to suggest solutions, to point out silver linings, to remind him of better times or better possibilities, to offer the perspective of someone on the outside who could see things he couldn't see from inside his pit of despair. Something in a quieter neighborhood or closer to nature. Remember how you used to love hiking? There are some nice places. With what money, Maria? Marcos would cut her off, his voice sharp as a knife, honed by years of practice, cutting down hope before it could take root. You think apartments grow on trees? You think I'm made of money? Everything's expensive. Everything's a ripoff. You need first month, last month, security deposit. That's 3 months' rent just to move in. And I'm barely making 1 month's rent as it is. Besides, what's the point? One apartment's the same as another. 4 walls and a roof. That's all it is. Moving won't change anything. A book club, or maybe one of those community centers where... Community centers. Marcos would scoff, the word dripping with disdain, like it was something dirty he didn't want to touch. Full of nosy people asking questions and pretending they care. Bunch of lonely retirees with nothing better to do than gossip and judge everyone else. No thanks. I'm fine right where I am. You just spent 20 minutes telling me how unhappy you. I'm fine, Maria. I'm fine. His voice would rise slightly, that edge coming in that signaled the conversation was approaching dangerous territory. The point where he might say something he'd regret, or she might say something that would hurt, and they'd have to navigate. Another week of awkwardness before the next Sunday call. This is just how life is. Some people get lucky. Most people don't. I'm in the second category. No point pretending otherwise. No point living in fantasy land like some people. Never mind that they'd had their own struggles, their own challenges, their own dark nights. Never mind that Maria's success wasn't luck, but the result of choices she'd made differently than Marcos had made his. That's all there was to it. She'd learned from experience that confronting Marcos directly only made him defensive and angry. He'd lash out, say hurtful things, maybe not call her back for weeks, and then she'd feel guilty for being honest, and he'd feel justified in his belief that everyone judged him and nobody understood, and he was alone in the world. Or something funny one of her kids had said, or plans for the upcoming holiday that Marcos would probably find some excuse not to attend. I should probably get going. Talk to you next week? Yeah, sure, next week. You too. At his negativity was a wall he'd built brick by brick, complaint by complaint, until it surrounded him completely and kept everyone out. Bet you can't push people away with both hands and then complain that you're alone. The general social fabric of workplace life. They'd bonded over their similar sense of humor, their shared frustration with management's incompetence, their mutual love of basketball, even though neither of them played anymore. He'd moved to a different company, a better position, a more stable industry. He'd navigated the economic chaos of the last decade with a grace that Marcos both admired and resented. He was one of those naturally upbeat people, the kind who seemed to bounce through existence with an energy that defied logic and occasionally defied physics. Things went wrong for Daniel, too. Of course they did. Life was life, but somehow he didn't let the bad things define him, didn't let disappointments become identity, didn't let setbacks become permanent conditions. How could Daniel be so cheerful when the world was clearly such a difficult place? Was he stupid? Was he blind? Was he just really good at denial? Or was there something wrong with Marcos, some defect in his wiring that made him incapable of experiencing joy, incapable of seeing the good, incapable of feeling hope? That last question was the one that haunted him, but it was too big to face, so he usually translated it into resentment toward Daniel instead. Easier to be annoyed at someone else's happiness than to question why you couldn't feel happy yourself. Disappointing. When's the last time you actually had fun? And Marcos would always have an excuse ready, polished and practiced, deployed with the efficiency of someone who'd said no so many times it had become automatic, which was technically true most of the time, because when you're depressed and bitter and isolated, your body responds accordingly. Headaches, backaches, general malaise. Nothing specific enough to diagnose, but real enough to use as an excuse. The organization that would make the space more livable. But saying he had things to do sounded better than admitting he was just going to sit in front of the TV and marinate in his own negativity for another weekend. How could he maintain that optimism when there was so much evidence that optimism was naive at best and delusional at worst? Every invitation Daniel extended felt like a spotlight being shown on Marcus's failures. Look at Daniel with his friends and his social life and his ability to enjoy things. Look at Daniel with his stable job and his good attitude and his functioning relationships. Look at what you're not, Marcos. Look at what you've failed to become. Easier to avoid the comparison. Easier to stay home where the only person judging him was himself. And he'd grown so accustomed to his own judgment, it barely registered anymore, like background noise you learn to ignore. Either way, it made him uncomfortable, made him feel guilty, made him aware that he was failing at yet another thing, This time, friendship. Regret that he'd pushed away another connection, closed another door, built another brick in the wall that isolated him from everyone and everything. Because relief was immediate and regret was abstract, and humans are wired to avoid immediate discomfort, even when it leads to long-term suffering. His life had come to this, that he was the architect of his own misery, that he'd built this prison and locked himself inside. Anger felt like armor protecting him from hope. He chose it actively, deliberately, though he would never have described it that way if you'd asked him. In his mind, he was simply being realistic, simply seeing the world as it truly was, simply refusing to be fooled by false optimism or naive positivity that promised things would get better when all the evidence suggested they wouldn't. Being honest in a world full of liars and deniers, and people who pretended everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. A theme of quiet desperation that Thoreau wrote about, but that most people don't really understand until they're living it themselves. Catalog grievances, adding new ones to the collection, polishing old ones until they gleamed. Go to bed, stare at the ceiling, eventually sleep. Wake up, do it all again. And Marcus's life became smaller and smaller, contracting around him like a shrinking room in a nightmare, the walls closing in inch by inch until he could barely breathe, barely move, barely remember what it felt like to have space, to have freedom, to have possibility. Hernandez had died 15 years ago, a heart attack that took him quickly and without warning on a Tuesday afternoon while he was mowing the lawn. 1 minute he was alive, pushing the mower across the grass under the hot summer sun. The next minute he was on the ground, the mower still running beside him, his heart simply stopping like a clock that had run down, like a machine that had finally worn out after years of hard use. The relationship had been complicated the way father-son relationships often are, marked by misunderstandings and unspoken resentments, and a fundamental inability to communicate across the gulf of their different temperaments, different generations, different ways of being in the world. He'd come from Mexico as a young man, crossed the border legally with papers and hope, worked construction jobs that broke his body bit by bit over 40 years until his hands were gnarled and his back was curved and his knees barely worked. He'd believed in hard work, in keeping your head down, in not complaining, in doing what needed to be done without expecting thanks or recognition or reward beyond your paycheck. Kept a roof over their heads, sent his kids to school, did his duty as he understood it. But he'd never been warm, never been affectionate, never been the kind of father who played catch or helped with homework or told his kids he loved them or was proud of them. But he never said so, and in families, what goes unsaid has just as much power as what gets spoken, sometimes more. They'd never quite managed to bridge the gap between who they were and who they wished they could be to each other. Working-class neighborhood where all the houses looked the same and all the lawns were patchy and all the cars in the driveways were old. They'd been drinking beer. Marcos was in his 20s then, old enough to drink with his father man to man, though they still didn't really know how to be men together, and watching the sun go down in silence, because silence was what they defaulted to when they ran out of small talk. Saying much so when he did speak came out harsh and gravelly like an engine that hadn't been used in a while. The thing about life is that it tends to give you back what you put into it. You put in bitterness, you get bitterness back. You put in kindness, you get kindness back. It's like an echo chamber in a cave. Whatever you shout into the darkness, that's what comes bouncing back to you, usually louder than you sent it out. Never stopped being kind to people, even when people weren't kind to her. And you know what? Good things came back to her. Not money, we never had money, but community, love, respect. People showed up for her, helped her when she needed help. That's what she got back. Too focused on his own plans and dreams to pay attention to an old man's wisdom. too certain he knew better, that his generation understood things the old generation didn't, that the world had changed and old wisdom didn't apply anymore. Of wasted years pressing down on his shoulders, like a physical burden he couldn't put down, Marcos would remember those words and feel a twist of something in his chest regret, maybe, or recognition, or resistance, or some combination of all three. Law about echoes and mirrors and reaping what you sow. Then Marcos had spent years, decades really, shouting nothing but anger and bitterness and resentment into the cave of his life, until he couldn't distinguish between cause and effect, between what he was experiencing and what he was creating, between what was happening to him and what he was doing to himself. He'd built his entire identity around his suffering, around his disadvantages, around the unfairness of life. If he let go of that story, who would he be? What be left? Change requires surrender, and surrender requires admitting that you might have been wrong. And admitting you've been wrong for years, that you've wasted time, that you've hurt yourself and others, that you could have done things differently. That's a bitter pill to swallow. Sometimes it's easier to keep suffering than to admit you didn't have to suffer. Sometimes we have to become so tired of carrying the weight of our bitterness that we finally become willing to set it down and see what happens when our hands are empty. It was approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and transformative, building in intensity even though he couldn't see it yet, couldn't feel it coming, had no idea that his entire life was about to change because of a phone call from a friend who refused to give up, a mountain trail he didn't want to climb, and a cave he'd be terrified to enter. He was still stuck in his patterns, still trapped in his echo chamber of negativity, still waiting for the world to change, while refusing to consider that he might need to change first. He was still the man who saw only darkness, who expected only disappointment, who believed only in entropy and decay and the inevitable grinding down of all things, who looked at the world through a lens of resentment and saw only evidence confirming his resentment, who pushed away connection and then felt lonely, who avoided hope and then felt hopeless, who created his own suffering and then blamed everyone else for it. And sometimes, just sometimes, darkness is exactly what we need to finally understand the nature of light. Summer was fading into fall, the air growing cooler, the days growing shorter, the light taking on that particular golden quality it has in autumn when everything seems more beautiful because you know it's temporary. It's dying. Winter is coming. It would start small, barely noticeable, like the first hairline fracture in a dam before the flood, like the first tiny crack in the ice before the thaw. We leave him standing at the edge of a transformation he couldn't yet imagine, about to take a step he didn't know he needed to take, about to learn a lesson his soul had been waiting years, maybe his whole life, to receive. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, unexpected and unwelcome, like most interruptions to Marcos's carefully constructed routine of isolation and self-pity. Marcos was sitting in his usual spot by the window, coffee growing cold in his hands, staring out at nothing in particular, just existing in that gray space between sleep and wakefulness that had become his default state. A photo from years ago when they'd both been younger, and Marcos had still smiled for cameras. They were at some company event, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning like idiots, both believing in futures that hadn't turned out the way they'd expected. He'd been avoiding Daniel's calls for months now, each unanswered ring another brick in the wall between himself and the outside world, another small assertion of his right to be left alone, another tiny act of self-protection that was actually self-destruction, though he couldn't see it that way. It was one of his most admirable and most annoying qualities, depending on which end of that persistence you were on. Maybe it was loneliness disguised as curiosity. Maybe it was the autumn sunlight slanting through his window in a particular way that reminded him of better times. Or maybe, just maybe, some part of his soul knew that this call would change everything, Even if his conscious mind had no idea what was coming, even if he answered with reluctance and resentment, even if he had every intention of saying no to whatever Daniel wanted. "Hey, man, you actually answered." Daniel's voice came through bright and surprised, like he'd won a small lottery, like this was a gift he hadn't expected. "I was starting to think you'd changed your number and forgotten to tell me." Annoyed because Daniel's cheerfulness felt like an accusation, a reminder that some people manage to be happy despite everything, while Marcos couldn't seem to manage it at all. Just the blunt question that skipped past all the social niceties and got straight to the point, because social niceties were exhausting, and Marcos didn't have the energy for them. Confirmed his belief that he was an asshole while simultaneously justifying his behavior as honesty in a world full of fake pleasantries. Kept extending invitations that Marcos kept declining. Up to Monte Verde, you know the trail? Marcos did know the trail, vaguely, from years ago when he still did things like hiking, when he still went outside for reasons other than necessity, when he still believed that nature and fresh air and physical activity could make you feel better about life. Like you make a sound and it echoes back in this really cool way. It's this whole natural phenomenon thing. We're packing lunch, making a day of it. Beautiful weather forecasted. Sunny, mid-60s, perfect fall day. I thought maybe you'd want to come along. Get some fresh air, stretch your legs, see something other than those four walls of yours. The thought of spending an entire day with Daniel's cheerful friends, because of course there would be friends. Daniel collected friends the way some people collected stamps, had this whole network of people who actually seemed to like him and want to spend time with him. The thought of making small talk and pretending to enjoy himself and being around all that happiness and energy when he felt like a black hole that absorbed light without giving anything back. It felt exhausting before it even began. "I'm not really up for." "Before you say no," Daniel interrupted, his voice taking on a tone that was gentle but firm, the kind of tone you use with someone you care about when you're not going to take no for an answer, when you're going to push back against their resistance, because you know they need something they don't want to accept. Just think about it for a second. And I mean really think about it, not just your automatic no. When's the last time you breathed air that didn't smell like car exhaust and garbage and 8 million people living on top of each other? The questions hung in the air, and Marcos realized he didn't have good answers. Months? A year? More? He'd lost track. Time had gotten weird when every day was the same, when you stopped marking occasions, when you let life become a blur of sameness. When's the last time you said yes to something new? When's the last time you surprised yourself? Daniel, come on, man. One day, just one day. If you hate it, you never have to come again. If you hate me for dragging you out there, I'll accept full responsibility, and you can spend the next year ignoring my calls guilt-free. But at least give it a shot. At least try. Also starving him of it. See you Saturday. Or perhaps, though he'd never admit it, not even to himself, a tiny spark of something that might have been anticipation, buried so deep under layers of cynicism that it barely registered as a feeling at all. He just sat there, coffee long since cold, looking out at the city and wondering what the hell he'd just gotten himself into and whether it was too late to back out, and knowing, somehow, that it was. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in October, deep and clean, and somehow both infinite and intimate at the same time. Considered just not answering the door when Daniel showed up. But he knew from experience that Daniel would just keep knocking, would call his phone, would probably get the building superintendent to let him in if he had to, would not take no for an answer, because that was Daniel's way. When he committed to something, he followed through. When he said he'd do something, he did it. A trait Marcos found both admirable and intensely annoying. The bathroom splashed cold water on his face that did nothing to wake him up or improve his mood. and stared at his reflection in the mirror. They showed you things you didn't want to see. A jacket he couldn't remember the last time he'd worn, pulling it from the back of his closet, where it had been hanging forgotten, smelling faintly of mothballs and lost possibilities. Procedure he'd been putting off, a reckoning he couldn't avoid. Daniel honked twice, a cheerful beep-beep that somehow managed to sound optimistic, like even his car horn was happy to be alive. Backpack, looking annoyingly energetic for 7 in the morning. When he saw Marcos, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. Not the polite smile of someone who felt obligated, but the real smile of someone who was genuinely happy to see a friend. I had a whole speech prepared about why you should come, arguments ready, the whole thing. Of course there would be company. Marcos didn't mind, but he'd already committed to this insanity. So he just climbed into the passenger seat and buckled his seatbelt and prepared himself for a long day of pretending to be a person who enjoyed things. Daniel chatted the whole time about work, about his kids who were doing well in school, about his wife who'd just gotten promoted, about a new restaurant he tried last week that had amazing tacos, filling the silence that Marcos offered with a steady stream of conversation that required minimal participation. 3 of Daniel's friends from his gym, all in their 40s and 50s, all radiating that same inexplicable cheerfulness that Daniel possessed, all apparently excited about spending a Saturday climbing a mountain for no good reason. Other than that, it was there, and the weather was nice. Lisa, a woman with kind eyes and laugh lines, and an energy that felt maternal, even though she probably wasn't that much older than Marcos. And James, quiet and lean, who nodded at Marcos, and then settled into his own silence that felt companionable rather than hostile. He settled into the back seat beside Lisa, stared out the window, and prepared himself to be politely ignored for the next several hours, while these people who actually liked each other enjoyed their day together. They tried to include him in conversation, asked him questions about himself that he answered in monosyllables, offered him trail mix from the bag they were passing around, acted like he belonged there, even though he clearly didn't. The lot was already half full with other cars, other people who apparently thought a good Saturday involved physical exertion and nature. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and earth, and something Marcos couldn't quite name, something he'd forgotten existed after years of breathing city air, thick with pollution and exhaust, and the accumulated smells of 8 million people living on top of each other. Marcos stood there feeling underprepared and out of place in his old jeans and his father's flannel shirt, the only person without a proper hiking backpack, without proper hiking boots, without any idea what he was doing. It's about a 3-mile hike up to the caves, not too steep for the most part, just steady. We'll take it at whatever pace works. No rush. This is supposed to be fun, remember? Fun. Right. Marcos had almost forgotten what that word meant. His lungs burned with an intensity that felt punishing, like his body was angry at him for all the months of neglect, all the sitting and stagnating and letting himself deteriorate. His legs protested every step, muscles that hadn't been used in this way suddenly being asked to climb and climb and climb. His lower back ached with each step on the uneven terrain, a sharp reminder that he wasn't young anymore, that he couldn't just bounce back from inactivity the way he might have 20 years ago. Until they were visible ahead, but far enough that their conversation was just ambient sound, indistinct voices mixing with birdsong and the rustle of leaves and his own labored breathing. The 3rd time, his face showing genuine concern rather than judgment, but Marcos couldn't tell the difference anymore, couldn't distinguish between someone caring about him and someone pitying him. We can take breaks whenever you need. This isn't a race. I'm going to have a heart attack out here and die on this stupid mountain, and it'll serve. Daniel right for pressuring me into doing something I clearly wasn't equipped to handle. Probably making jokes about me when I'm not close enough to hear. At least at home, I can be pathetic in private, trying not to look as destroyed as he felt, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, even though he was pretty sure everyone could see exactly how hard this was for him, exactly how much he was struggling, exactly how pathetic he was dirty and broken and disappointing. And beyond that, more mountains rising up into the distance, layer upon layer of blue-gray peaks fading into the horizon like waves, each one slightly lighter than the last, until they disappeared into sky that was so blue it almost hurt to look at. The sound was different up here, too, wind moving through trees, birds calling to each other, the distant sound of water running somewhere, all of it mixing into a kind of natural symphony that was nothing like the constant urban noise he'd grown so accustomed to. He didn't even hear it anymore. Noticeable, like the first crack in ice when the temperature starts to rise, like the first loosening of a fist that's been clenched so long it's forgotten how to open. He forgot to be angry at Daniel for dragging him here, or at himself for being so out of shape, or at the universe for being cruel. A hairline fracture in the wall, a tiny opening where light could get in if he let it. Just simple statement of fact, simple acknowledgement of what was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Small acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there was still beauty in the world if you looked for it, if you allowed yourself to see it, if you stopped insisting that everything was terrible long enough to notice what was actually in front of you. And then they were moving again, but this time the trail leveled out, following the ridge line instead of climbing, and Marcos found he could keep pace more easily. Almost though he wouldn't have admitted this, even under torture, almost pleasant in a painful sort of way. The light changed from morning gold to midday white, and Marcos found himself not thinking about time at all, not wondering when this would be over, not counting down the minutes until he could go home. Existing in the moment instead of past regret or future dread. The caves I was telling you about. They'd arrived at an outcropping of rock where the mountain face opened up into a series of dark openings, like mouths waiting to swallow the unwary, like doorways into some other realm, like thresholds between worlds. The stone around the opening was ancient, weathered by millennia of wind and rain and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles, carved by forces beyond human control into shapes that seemed almost intentional, almost designed, though Marcos knew they were just the random result of geological processes that didn't care about beauty, or meaning, or anything beyond physics and time. They'd entered, the anticipation palpable in the way they moved, the way they talked, the way they looked at the cave like children, looking at a present they're about to unwrap. Just empty space inside solid stone. There was nothing to be afraid of. The acoustics are insane. And so, against his better judgment, against the warning whisper in his gut, against every instinct telling him to stay outside where it was light and safe and familiar, Marcos took a breath and stepped into the cave. The cool, damp air felt alive somehow, pressing against his skin, filling his lungs with each breath, carrying the smell of stone and water and deep earth, of places sunlight never reaches, of time measured in millennia instead of minutes. Touch. Deliberate columns and curtains and frozen waterfalls of stone, shapes that suggested intentional design, even though they were just the patient work of water and time. Each repetition slightly quieter, slightly more distant. The sound waves traveling through the chamber, bouncing off walls, reflecting and re-reflecting until the last echo faded into silence so complete it felt like a presence. Like the absence of sound was itself a kind of sound. Cacophony before fading back into that profound silence. He stood apart from the group, something cold and uncomfortable settling in his stomach as he listened to the echoes, as he felt the sound wash over him from all directions, as he experienced the strange sensation of hearing his friends' voices come back at them distorted and multiplied. It felt too much like a metaphor, too much like the universe was trying to teach him a lesson he wasn't ready to learn, too much like standing in front of a mirror that showed you truth you didn't want to see. All the shouting, gentle in the presence of Marcus's obvious discomfort. They say this cave system goes back for miles, connects to underground rivers and everything. But this main chamber is the best for acoustics. Something about the shape of it, the way the sound waves travel and reflect, creates this perfect echo effect. Wanted to keep his voice to himself, keep his words unexpressed, keep his internal landscape private and protected from this strange mirroring that felt too revealing, too vulnerable, too much like confession. He'd give them exactly what they were asking for. And then he released it, not in a playful yell or a cheerful greeting like the others had done, but in a raw, primal expression of all the bitterness and anger and frustration and disappointment and grief and rage that he'd been carrying for years, for decades. For so long, it had become part of his fundamental structure. The surface. Nothing ever works out. Everyone lets you down. It's all pointless. The words exploded out of him with a force that surprised even Marcus himself, erupting from some deep place he usually kept locked and buried, from the reservoir of pain he'd been accumulating and storing and refusing to process, from that wound at the center of his being that never healed because he kept picking at it, kept pouring salt on it, kept refusing to let it close. Works out, lets you down, down, pointless. Pointless, pointless, less. The cave threw his words back at him, amplified and multiplied, surrounding him from all sides like an attack, like an accusation, like the universe itself was screaming his own bitterness back at him louder than he'd sent it out. The echoes seemed to go on forever, repeating and overlapping, building on each other like waves compounding, until it felt like the cave itself was screaming at him, condemning him, punishing him with his own words turned into weapons. Hadn't his own bitterness. Knees trying to catch his breath, trying to slow his racing heart, trying to understand what had just happened. And with each repetition, something terrible was dawning on him, a realization he didn't want to accept, but couldn't quite push away, a truth that was forcing its way into his consciousness, despite all his resistance, reflecting it all back to him, amplified, with his expectations. And what had he been putting out? Nothing but darkness. Around, Marcos wasn't ready to give, like the most exhausting thing in the world. No, I'm not okay. A difficult situation, isn't it? They didn't hike back down immediately. Low voices about inconsequential things, the weather forecast for next week, the trail conditions on the way down, a funny thing someone's kid had said at breakfast that morning. Safe topics. Neutral ground. They were giving Marcos space while still surrounding him with presence, and he found himself grateful for it in a way that felt unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable, because gratitude wasn't an emotion he'd practiced much lately, wasn't something he'd allowed himself to feel when he was so committed to his grievances. Food seemed irrelevant right now. Eating seemed like a distraction from something more important happening inside him, some kind of internal earthquake that was rearranging his landscape in ways he couldn't yet fully see or understand. Sound of them, but the feeling, that visceral, undeniable sense of being confronted with his own reflection, distorted and amplified until he couldn't look away, couldn't deny it, couldn't pretend he didn't see what was being shown to him. The life he'd settled into, sunken into, allowed himself to be swallowed by like quicksand, like tar, like something that pulled you down inch by inch until you couldn't remember what it felt like to stand upright. The isolation he'd convinced himself was self-protection, but was starting to look more and more like self-imprisonment, like he'd locked himself in a cell and thrown away the key and then blamed the world for keeping him trapped. Maybe more like a mirror being held up, forcing him to see what he'd become, what he'd been doing to himself, what role he'd been playing in creating the very reality he was so convinced was being imposed on him from outside. His friends settled onto the rock beside him, close enough to talk comfortably, but far enough away to not feel intrusive, to not crowd, to not pressure. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, looking out at the valley spread below them like a painting, like a promise, like evidence that beauty still existed in the world, even when you couldn't see it from where you were standing. The sky was so blue it looked fake, looked photoshopped, looked too perfect to be real. And the silence between them was comfortable in a way Marcos hadn't experienced in years. The kind of silence that exists between people who've known each other long enough that they don't need to fill every moment with words. Marcos could say no, and Daniel would accept it, would give him space, wouldn't push. That's who Daniel was: patient, persistent, but never pushy. Always willing to try, never forcing. Some internal barrier had cracked, and the old defenses didn't quite fit anymore. Like trying to close a door that had swollen in its frame. Like trying to squeeze into clothes that no longer fit because you'd grown or shrunk, or changed shape in ways you hadn't noticed until you tried to be who you used to be and found you couldn't. It was just echoes, just sound bouncing off rocks. That's all it was. Physics, acoustics, nothing mystical, nothing significant. Sometimes a cave is just a cave, and sometimes it's a teacher. When had he stopped really seeing the people in his life, stopped noticing them as individuals with their own struggles and depths, and started seeing them only as characters in his story of suffering, only as supporting actors in the drama of his grievances? Daniel's face was lined now, creases around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there when they'd first met at that company where they'd both worked, back before the layoffs and the disappointments and the slow drift of Marcus's life into its current state of stagnation. But those lines didn't make Daniel look old or worn down. They made him look lived in, like a house that's been well loved and well used, like a favorite book whose pages have been turned so many times they've become soft. Decided to share them before he'd vetted them, before he'd considered whether this was safe or wise, or something he'd regret. About life being like an echo chamber, that whatever you put out comes back to you. Sounds like a wise man. Thought the rules that applied to everyone else wouldn't apply to me because I was special, because I worked hard, because I deserved better. We're all just figuring it out as we go, making mistakes, learning lessons, hopefully growing. That's all any of us can do. You wake up looking forward to the day instead of dreading it. And me? I've been sitting in my apartment for years, wondering why everything's so dark, why nothing ever goes right, why I can't catch a break while everyone else seems to be doing fine. And I realize he trailed off, not sure how to finish the thought, not sure he wanted to finish it, because finishing it meant accepting something he'd been resisting for so long. Couldn't go back to the comfortable fiction he'd been living in, where he was the victim and the world was the villain, shouting negativity into the world and then being surprised when negativity is what comes back, expecting the worst and then finding the worst everywhere I look because that's what I'm looking for, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy with every bitter thought, every resentful word, every expectation of disappointment. It just gave me back what I put in. And if the cave is a metaphor for life, if the echo is how the universe works, then he couldn't finish. The implication was too big, too terrifying, too much to accept all at once. Just being there while Marcos wrestled with the truth that was dawning on him. The realization he'd been resisting with every fiber of his being, because accepting it meant taking responsibility, meant admitting he'd been wrong, meant acknowledging that he had more power than he'd thought, but he'd been using it in exactly the wrong way. Himself. Marcos felt something wet on his face and realized with surprise that he was crying, tears running down his cheeks that he didn't bother to wipe away. When was the last time he'd cried? Years, maybe decades. He'd convinced himself that tears were weakness, that feeling things too deeply was dangerous, that maintaining control meant never letting emotion break through the surface before it could destroy the container. Or is this just who I am, and I'm stuck with it." Daniel was quiet, thinking, and Marcos appreciated that he wasn't rushing to answer, wasn't offering some quick fix or easy solution, was taking the question seriously enough to really consider it. "What do you think would have happened if you'd whispered something different?" Marcos turned to look at him, not understanding at first where this was going. "What do you think would have come back then?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and profound, obvious once you heard it, but revolutionary if you really let it sink in. It was just a neutral reflector, a mirror made of sound and stone, following the laws of physics without moral judgment or emotional bias. Wasn't it just a bigger cave, a larger echo chamber, responding to what he put into it with the same neutral fidelity, the same perfect reflection, the same amplification of whatever signal he chose to send? When he expected rudeness, he interpreted everything through that lens and found rudeness everywhere. A neutral expression became a hostile glare. A distracted person became someone deliberately ignoring him. A mistake became a personal attack. When he expected disappointment, he set himself up for failure by not trying, by sabotaging opportunities before they could disappoint him, by creating the very outcome he feared, and then calling it confirmation of his worldview. When he approached every interaction with suspicion and defensiveness, people responded in kind, mirroring his energy, creating exactly the hostile environment he'd been so sure already existed independent of his contribution to it. It was like one of those optical illusions where you're looking at a picture that seems to show one thing, a vase, maybe, and then someone points out that it's actually showing something completely different too. Faces in profile, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, can't go back to seeing only the vase, can't pretend you don't know both images exist in the same space. Misfortunes and injustices and disappointments that he was powerless to affect, that he was merely experiencing as a passive victim, that were being done to him by a cruel world and an uncaring universe and other people who didn't give a damn about his suffering. What if he'd been standing in front of a mirror his whole life, making angry faces at his reflection, and then being confused and bitter about why the reflection looked so angry? What if he'd been the one shouting darkness into the cave and then acting surprised when darkness came echoing back? What if he'd had more power all along than he'd thought, but he'd been using that power to create exactly the reality he claimed to hate? "I've wasted so much time," Marcos said, the words heavy, with regret, with grief for the years he couldn't get back, for the life he could have lived if he'd understood this sooner, if someone had explained it to him in a way he could hear, if he'd been willing to listen when people tried to tell him. "You're just redirecting it at yourself instead of at the world." But it's the same energy, the same poison, the same echo chamber of darkness. Stop letting your past determine your future. Stop giving your history more power than your choices. I'm just a guy who's made a lot of mistakes and learned a few things along the way. Sometimes the hard way, sometimes the really hard way. It's just how attention works, how the human brain functions, how reality responds to where we put our awareness. So if you believe everything's terrible, your brain becomes a heat-seeking missile for terrible things, ignoring or minimizing everything else, collecting evidence for your case like a prosecutor building an argument. You're interpreting the same events through a different lens. About where he'd been directing the beam of his awareness for all these years, like a spotlight only illuminating the darkest corners, only highlighting the broken things, only revealing the evidence that confirmed his belief that the world was hostile and life was unfair and hope was for fools. That was love, wasn't it? That was loyalty. That was someone showing up week after week, even when they weren't welcomed, even when they were rebuffed, even when it would have been easier to give up. He'd thought of it as obligation, as duty, as pity, as something vaguely insulting, rather than as the gift it actually was, the gift of someone refusing to let you disappear into isolation, someone throwing you a rope even when you keep pushing it away, someone believing you're worth the effort even when you've stopped believing it yourself, who had invited him on this hike even though Marcos had turned down dozens of previous invitations. Who was sitting here now, on this rock, offering friendship and wisdom without judgment or resentment, without keeping score, without demanding anything in return. That was someone choosing to see the good in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Someone deciding you were worth persisting with, even when you kept giving them reasons to walk away. Too focused on what he didn't have to see what he did have. His lungs, even though they burned, had kept breathing, had kept supplying oxygen, had kept doing their job. His heart, even though it had pounded, had kept beating, had kept pumping blood through his veins, had kept him alive. When was the last time he'd appreciated the miracle of being alive instead of complaining about the burden of existence? And the view itself, when had he stopped seeing beauty? When had he lost the ability to look at a sunset or a tree or a mountain and feel that expansion in his chest, that sense of wonder, that recognition that you're part of something larger than your own small grievances? It wasn't that the beauty had disappeared from the world. It was that he'd stopped looking for it, stopped allowing himself to see it, stopped believing he deserved to experience it, stopped thinking joy was something available to someone like him, who'd been dealt such a bad hand, who'd suffered such injustices, who'd been so wronged by life, just looking in the wrong direction. But the great thing about direction is that you can change it anytime you want. You're not stuck looking where you've been looking. You can turn your head. You can shift your gaze. You can choose to see something different. Enjoying themselves, enjoying each other, enjoying being alive on a beautiful day in a beautiful place. When had the symphony of existence become just noise, just background static, just one more thing to complain about? Eventually, Daniel stood up, stretching, joints popping in a way that made them both chuckle, because getting old was a shared experience, a common ground, something that happened to everyone who was lucky enough to live long enough to complain about it. It's a couple hours down, and we want to get to the cars before it gets dark. Mountain trails at night are no joke. I need to do something first. The darkness yawned before him, not menacing now, but somehow inviting, like it was waiting for him to try again, to do it differently this time, like it was offering him a second chance, a do-over, an opportunity to put something different into the echo chamber and see what came back. And for a moment, Marcos felt that same clutch of fear and resistance he'd felt before, that instinct to turn around, to run back to the safety of sunlight, to avoid this confrontation with his own reflection. Listening, waiting, ready to give back whatever he chose to give it. The cave didn't judge. It didn't care. It would echo his darkness or his light with equal fidelity, would amplify his bitterness or his gratitude with the same neutral precision. It was his choice what to put in, his choice what would come back. He stood in the center of the chamber, closed his eyes, and when he opened his mouth, what came out was barely more than a whisper. His voice soft and tentative, like he was learning a new language and wasn't quite sure if he was pronouncing the words correctly. Different way of being. Thank you for my breath. Thank you for my body that carried me up that mountain, even though I complained the whole way. Thank you for Daniel, who didn't give up on me even when I gave him every reason to. Thank you for this day. Thank you for this beauty. Thank you for this chance to see things differently. But instead of feeling accused or attacked like he had, when his bitterness had bounced back at him, Marcos felt held. The gratitude he'd whispered, tentative and uncertain as it was, bounced back to him amplified, coming at him from every direction, until he was standing in the middle of a chamber filled with thanks, saturated with appreciation, wrapped in acknowledgement of beauty and grace, and the simple gift of being alive. Completely, in that space where possibility exists when you haven't closed it off, with bitterness and resignation. The recognition that he had more power than he'd thought. The understanding that the echo chamber would give back what he put in, which meant he could choose what to put in, which meant he wasn't trapped, wasn't doomed, wasn't destined to repeat the same patterns forever. But these tears were different from the ones he'd cried on the rock outside. Those had been tears of recognition, of grief for time lost, of mourning for the years he'd wasted shouting darkness. Something that felt dangerously close to joy, or at least to relief, or maybe just to the simple recognition that he'd been carrying a weight he didn't have to carry, fighting a battle he didn't have to fight, creating a prison he didn't have to live in. Yet, I'm ready. He was beginning to understand that the world he experienced wasn't separate from him, wasn't something happening to him independent of his participation, but was instead a reflection of what he brought to it, an echo of what he put out, a mirror showing him back to himself with perfect, neutral fidelity. If he brought resentment, resentment would be reflected back from every interaction. A simple principle, really. Almost too simple. The kind of thing people say, and you nod along with, but don't really believe, because it sounds like greeting card philosophy, like cheap self-help platitudes, like something too easy to be true. It wasn't wishful thinking or positive mental attitude, or any kind of psychological trick. Marcos found himself noticing things he'd been too miserable to see on the way up, too focused on his discomfort to appreciate. The sound of water somewhere off the trail, a stream flowing over rocks, creating music without trying, just being what it was. The feel of the earth solid and reliable under his feet, supporting his weight, holding him up, never asking anything in return. Pink that looked too vivid to be real, too beautiful to be natural, like someone had turned up the saturation on reality just to make a point. They swapped contact information, made vague plans to do this again soon, promises that might or might not be kept, but felt good to make anyway. Actually allowed himself to think that maybe he could be part of something, part of a group, part of a community, instead of always being the outsider looking in and complaining about being left out while simultaneously refusing every invitation. He was processing, integrating, letting the lessons of the day settle into his bones, into his understanding, into his sense of what was possible. He just drove, occasionally glancing over with a small smile, giving Marcos the space he needed to think, to feel, to begin the work of reorganizing his understanding of how life worked. Voice warm with genuine affection, with the kind of care that doesn't keep score, that doesn't hold grudges, that keeps showing up even when it's not reciprocated. We keep showing up until the person we care about is ready to show up for themselves. Next week? The words came out before he'd consciously decided to say them, surprising him as much as they clearly surprised Daniel. You're going to be sore tomorrow. Sane, everything. He had a place to sleep, a place to keep his things, a place to call home even if it wasn't the home he dreamed of. Not compared to the wealthy, not compared to the successful, not compared to where he'd thought he'd be by this age, compared to alone without anyone who cared. He had so much, but it didn't have to stay that way. He could change it. Not all at once, that would be overwhelming, would set him up for failure, would trigger his old patterns of starting strong and then giving up when it got hard. One choice to see what was right instead of what was wrong. World had moved on without him. These stories show us that it's possible to transform our lives through changing what we reflect into the world, as long as we understand the echo chamber principle. Don't you agree? And activate notifications to receive an alert whenever a new Daily Light message is published on this channel. The first morning after the hike, Marcos woke up the same way he'd woken up for years, with that familiar weight pressing down on his chest, that sense of dread settling over him like a heavy blanket that smothered breath and hope and any possibility of joy. The same life stretching ahead of him with all its problems and disappointments and reasons to stay in bed and pull the covers over his head and pretend the world didn't exist. Anymore, he caught himself as internal experiences, not external reality, as something happening inside him, not something being done to him by the universe, but that he would later recognize as the first step in a journey of 1,000 miles, the first crack in a dam before the flood, the first spark that would eventually become a fire. Like he was playing a game with himself that he didn't quite believe in, like he was trying on a new personality that didn't fit, like he was speaking a language he'd only just started learning and wasn't sure he'd ever become fluent in. And if he was going to take that lesson seriously, if he was going to actually apply it, instead of just having an interesting experience and then going right back to his old patterns, then he had to start somewhere. I have a place to sleep. The dread that usually gripped him loosened its hold just a little bit. Not gone, not disappeared, but less. Less like drowning and more like just being in deep water where you could still, with effort, keep your head above the surface. I'm grateful I'm alive. And saying it, even without fully feeling it yet, even without believing it completely, created a tiny opening, a small crack in the armor of his bitterness, where something new might eventually grow. He looked down at his legs, at his feet in those worn slippers with the hole near the toe, and instead of thinking about how he needed new slippers and couldn't afford them and wasn't, that just typical of his life, where everything was broken and nothing got replaced, he thought about the fact that these legs worked. They'd carried him through 58 years of life without ever asking for thanks, without ever going on strike, without ever demanding appreciation for the millions of steps they'd taken, the thousands of miles they'd walked, the countless times they'd gotten him where he needed to go. Thank you for carrying me. Thank you for not giving up even when I've treated you like shit, even when I've sat around for months not using you, even when I've fed you garbage food and given you no exercise and complained about every ache while never appreciating all the times you didn't ache. Of failure and betrayal. Had electricity to heat the water. Had a kitchen with a stove that worked most of the time, and a sink with running water, and a refrigerator that kept food cold. Miracles that he'd been treating as mundane entitlements for so long that he'd forgotten they were miracles at all. Had stopped seeing them as gifts and started seeing them as the bare minimum, the least the world owed him for the suffering he'd endured. Gifts that required complex systems of infrastructure and technology and human cooperation to exist, power grids and water treatment, plants and supply chains, and thousands of people doing their jobs, so that he could have hot coffee in his apartment on a Sunday morning. It was worthy of gratitude, even if everything else in your life was a mess. Winds he couldn't feel from here, but that were real nonetheless, part of the vast atmospheric circulation that made weather and seasons and life on Earth possible. When was the last time he'd paid attention to the simple fact that above all the concrete and brick and glass of the city, above all the human construction and complication, there was still sky, still weather, still natural forces that didn't care about politics or economics or personal grievances? He watched the clouds drift and shift and reform, their shapes constantly changing, and for just a moment, he felt connected to something larger than his own small life, part of a vast and beautiful system of air and water cycling endlessly through the atmosphere, part of a planet spinning through space, part of something incomprehensibly huge and ancient and indifferent to human suffering, but also, somehow, containing human suffering, holding it, giving it context within a larger story. But somehow it did. His brain had spent years practicing bitterness, and those neural pathways were deep and automatic, worn smooth by repeated use like a path through a forest that gets easier to follow every time you walk it, until, eventually, it's the only path you can see, until all the other possible routes are overgrown and forgotten. Complaining about the news, bad, always bad, confirming his belief that the world was going to hell. Resenting a driver who cut him off, probably did it on purpose, probably does it to everyone. People these days have no consideration. Assuming the worst about a neighbor's motives, why else would they park there? They're clearly trying to make life difficult for everyone else. The news was bad? Yes, but some news was neutral, or even good if you looked for it. The driver who cut him off was probably just distracted, probably didn't even see him, probably wasn't thinking about him at all, because most people are too wrapped up in their own lives to be deliberately cruel to strangers. He'd noticed the negative thought, but couldn't quite shift it, could only watch it play out like a movie he'd seen too many times, knowing how it ended, but unable to turn it off. Not changing it, not fixing it, not replacing it with something better, just seeing it happen with a bit more distance, a bit more perspective, like watching weather pass through instead of believing he was the weather. He'd been so identified with his thoughts, so convinced they were objective observations rather than subjective interpretations, that he couldn't distinguish between what was actually happening and what story he was telling himself about what was happening. Starting to recognize that there was a gap between events and his interpretation of events, between what the world did and what he made it mean, between reality and his story about reality. Their usual Sunday call, right on schedule at 3 p.m., Maria's punctuality as predictable as sunrise. About Maria calling every week despite his rudeness being love, being loyalty, being a gift he'd been too blind to recognize. About how he'd been treating Maria like an obligation and then feeling resentful that the relationship felt obligatory, never making the connection that maybe it felt that way because he was making it that way, because the energy he brought to the interaction was determining the quality of the interaction. On the second ring, before he could talk himself out of it, I was getting ready to, "Hey, Maria," Marcos said, and made a conscious effort to soften his tone, to inject some warmth that he didn't quite feel, but was willing to try to cultivate. "How are you?" There was a pause on the other end, like Maria was recalibrating, adjusting to this unexpected friendliness, trying to figure out what had changed, whether it was safe to trust this new energy, or whether it would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm good, actually," she said slowly, cautiously. "Busy week, but good. How are you? You sound different. Did something happen?" Did he? Marco supposed he must, if even his sister could detect a change over the phone after just a few words. Maybe he was different. Maybe something fundamental had shifted in that cave. Or maybe it was shifting now, in this moment, with this choice to show up differently in a relationship he'd been phoning in for years. "You?" Maria's surprise was evident, but not unkind, not mocking, just genuine astonishment that her brother, who hadn't left his apartment for anything but necessities in months, had voluntarily gone outside and done something active. "Marco, that's wonderful. Where did you go? How was it? Tell me everything." And Marcos found himself telling her. Not everything. The full emotional weight of the cave experience felt too raw, too private, too sacred to share yet, like something he needed to keep close until he understood it better himself. About how he'd realized, standing there in that darkness, that maybe he'd been doing the same thing in his life, putting out negativity and getting negativity back, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy with every bitter thought, every resentful word, every expectation of disappointment. To expect when he was vulnerable, that there was a way out if you were willing to try it. When was the last time he'd done anything worth being proud of? The words hit him like a physical blow, like something solid, connecting with something tender, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. "What are you going to do with this realization?" "I don't know," Marcos admitted. "Start small, I guess. Try to notice when I'm being negative and redirect. Look for things to be grateful for instead of things to complain about. Show up differently in relationships, including this one. I know I haven't been." He trailed off, not sure how to finish, how to acknowledge years of bad behavior without drowning in guilt about it, or explain, or justify. "You were hurting. Hurt people hurt people. I get it. I never took it personally, even when it felt personal. I knew you weren't really angry at me. You were angry at life, and I was just there, available to receive it." And for the first time in longer than Marcos could remember, he actually listened instead of just waiting for his turn to complain. Her youngest, Michael, was struggling in math, getting frustrated, starting to say he was stupid, and Maria was worried about his self-esteem. She was a nurse at a pediatric hospital, worked long shifts, dealt with sick kids and terrified parents, and the daily emotional weight of caring for people in crisis. It was hard work, important work, work that mattered, work that took a toll. That Maria had been struggling with some health issues, nothing serious, she said, but worrying, requiring tests and doctor visits, and the general anxiety of not knowing what was wrong with your body. That her marriage had been rocky lately, nothing catastrophic, but the usual strains of two people trying to navigate middle age and teenagers, and financial stress and the general challenge of staying connected when life pulls you in different directions. Easy, like she had it all together, like she didn't need help or support or someone to ask how she was doing and actually mean it. You had enough of your own. There was no space in our conversations for my stuff, and I didn't blame you for that. I really didn't. I knew you were struggling. I missed having a brother I could talk to instead of just a brother I worried about. An echo chamber focused only on his own voice, unable to hear anyone else's, unwilling to make room for anyone else's pain or joy or anything in between. Not just saying it. The sense that maybe he could be useful to someone, could offer something instead of just taking, could be part of someone else's life in a way that added value instead of subtracting it, could contribute instead of just consuming. He'd extended a small kindness to his sister just listening, just being present, just showing up differently in a relationship he'd been phoning in for years, and it had come back to him as the warmth of reconnection, the gift of being trusted with her struggles, the possibility of relationship instead of just obligation. And good was starting to come back. But he'd catch it earlier now, notice it faster, and whisper his thanks for small things before the bitterness could fully take hold. Sometimes it felt mechanical and false, and he was just going through the motions, mouthing words he didn't feel, pretending at a spiritual practice he wasn't sure he believed in. So even mechanically whispered gratitude, even gratitude he had to fake at first, still went out into the universe and came back as something different than the bitterness he'd been shouting for years. To ask himself what else could be true, what other way he could see this, what other meaning he could assign to neutral events that didn't automatically assume the worst. Some days he felt genuinely hopeful, genuinely grateful, genuinely connected to the beauty and grace around him, like he was finally seeing the world clearly after years of looking through dirty, distorted glass. On those days, he'd catch himself mid-spiral and think, this isn't working. I'm kidding myself. People don't change. I'm too old, too damaged, too far gone. This gratitude thing is bullshit. The cave was just a cave, and I read too much into it, and nothing's really different. And in the seeing, there was the possibility of choosing differently, even if he didn't always take that possibility, even if sometimes he chose the spiral anyway, because it was familiar, and familiar felt safer than new, even when familiar was killing him. But he did it anyway, every night before bed, writing down 3 things he was thankful for that day. More textured and detailed and personal. Grateful for the ache in his muscles after the Saturday hike with Daniel, proof that his body was still capable, still responsive, still getting stronger instead of just getting older. Grateful for the laughter he'd shared with Daniel and Robert at lunch after a hike, genuine belly laughter that he hadn't experienced in years, the kind that makes your face hurt and your sides ache and reminds you that joy is possible even when you've forgotten how to access it. Being in the world. Grateful for music that moved him, that made him feel something besides bitterness for the first time in forever. Grateful for hot showers that eased his aching back. Grateful for the neighbor's cat that sometimes sat in his window, keeping him company without demanding anything, just being there. For the simple fact of being alive, which he was slowly learning, was not a given, not something to take for granted, but a gift that millions of people lost today and would never experience again. A miracle that happened every second inhale, exhale, repeat, sustaining him without asking permission, without requiring gratitude, just doing its job, because that's what bodies do when they're working right. Slow shifting of his attention from what was wrong to what was right, from what was lacking to what was present, from bitterness to appreciation. He could look back at the early entries and see the difference, measure the change, recognize that something was actually shifting, even when it felt like he was just pretending, just going through motions, just faking it until he might one day make it. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in the kind of miraculous transformation you read about in testimonials and inspirational stories, where everything suddenly falls into place and the universe showers you with abundance because you finally learned the secret. This is evidence that something has shifted. He practiced interviewing in the mirror, worked on his body language, prepared answers to common questions. Okay, those applications didn't work. What could he learn from that? What could he adjust? How could he improve his approach? He kept trying, kept applying, kept refining. And after 6 weeks of consistent effort, of showing up even when it was hard, of persisting even when he wanted to quit, he got a call, an interview, and then a second interview, and then miraculously, surprisingly, almost shockingly, a job offer. But it was decent work for decent pay, with decent people in a decent environment. But honest work that needed doing, work that mattered to the people who depended on it, work that paid enough to cover his bills with a little left over. Evidence that when he showed up with hope instead of bitterness, with willingness instead of resentment, with openness instead of defensive cynicism, the world responded differently. He'd been himself, or at least a version of himself that was emerging, a version that was less defended, less bitter, less convinced that everyone was out to get him. But a genuine smile that reached her eyes, that suggested she saw something in him worth smiling about. Someone who might actually appreciate this opportunity instead of just seeing it as a stepping stone to something better. The daily practice of gratitude that was slowly rewiring his brain. The transformation that was happening inside him, even though it wasn't visible on paper. And I'm choosing differently now. But because moving his body seemed to help move his emotions, seemed to create momentum that carried over into other areas of his life. But the complaints were quieter now, and the aches felt different, like evidence of use rather than evidence of decay, like proof that he was doing something instead of just sitting around waiting to die. Smiling at neighbors who smiled back, creating small moments of connection that didn't cost anything but meant something. That reminded him he was part of a community, even if he'd been acting like a hermit. Worn into yourself over decades of repetition, started to inhabit his body instead of just dragging it around like unwanted luggage, started to appreciate it as the vehicle that carried him through life instead of resenting it as the source of aches and limitations. He showed genuine interest in her life, asked follow-up questions, remembered details from previous conversations. He offered help when she needed it, picking up her kids from school when her car was in the shop, helping Michael with his math homework over video chat, just being present and available instead of always absent and unavailable. Trusted him more, included him more, invited him to family dinners, asked his advice, treated him like a brother again instead of like a project or a problem or a person to be managed. Did all the small things that families do when they're actually functioning, when they're connected instead of just related, when they choose each other instead of just being stuck with each other by accident of birth. Through Robert, he met others who were also on their own journeys of change, also learning to navigate the echo chamber of life with more intention and awareness, also discovering that they had more power than they'd thought, but had been using it unconsciously, creating realities they didn't want, and then wondering why life was so hard. 6 or 7 people, ages ranging from late 30s to early 70s, all at different stages of their journeys, but united by a common recognition that life reflects what you put into it, that you get back what you give out, that the echo chamber is always listening and always responding. Reminded each other, when someone started slipping back into old patterns, that they had a choice, that they weren't victims, that they had more power than they sometimes remembered. Found himself being useful, being valued, being part of something larger than his own small life. There were still days, plenty of them, when bitterness crept back in, when old patterns reasserted themselves, when he found himself shouting into the darkness instead of whispering into the light. Days when he woke up with that old weight on his chest and couldn't quite shift it, couldn't quite find the gratitude, couldn't quite remember why he was trying so hard when it would be easier to just give up and go back to the comfortable misery he'd known for so long. Now he understood that he had a choice, that one bad day didn't erase all his progress. That transformation wasn't a destination you arrived at once, and then you're done, but a practice. A daily choice, a constant returning to the principles you know are true, even when they're hard to live. Marcos agreed immediately, curious to see how he'd experience it now, with everything that had changed, with the person he was becoming, with the understanding he'd gained. He kept pace with the group, participated in conversation, actually enjoyed the journey instead of just enduring it. That man who'd been trapped in his own echo chamber without knowing it, shouting darkness and wondering why his life was so dark. Necessary lesson, like returning to a place that had changed him, that had cracked him open, that had shown him truth he'd been avoiding for decades. Just his normal voice, steady and sure, offering to the darkness what he'd learned to offer to his life, what he was learning to offer to every moment, every interaction, every choice. I'm grateful for this cave that showed me how I'd been creating my own suffering. I'm grateful for Daniel, who never gave up on me. I'm grateful for Maria, who kept calling, even when I was awful to her. I'm grateful for this body, this breath, this life, this moment. I'm grateful for love. I'm grateful for grace. I'm grateful that the echo chamber is always listening, always responding, always getting back what I put in. I'm grateful that I get to choose, that I have power, that I'm not stuck. That transformation is possible. But they were tears of joy this time, tears of release, tears of profound recognition that he had been transformed by something as simple and profound as changing what he reflected into the world. Expectation every choice. They hiked back down in companionable silence, and when they reached the parking lot, Marcos turned to look back up at the mountain where the cave sat hidden among the trees. Moved through. Completely different from the one you used to inhabit. Fundamentally, undeniably different. And hope, and watching with wonder as those same things came echoing back to him from all directions, surrounding him, sustaining him, reminding him that the universe is always listening, always responsive, always ready to give back whatever we're willing to give. Echoes. And now I ask you, did you enjoy seeing how Marcos transformed his life by changing what he whispered into his echo chamber? We've talked about the echo chamber. We've seen how Marcos learned that life reflects back what we put into it, that when we shout bitterness, bitterness surrounds us, and when we whisper gratitude, gratitude echoes back from all directions. It's a powerful principle, one that can transform your life if you apply it consistently, if you practice it daily, if you let it sink deep enough into your bones that it becomes not just something you know, but something you are. Trick or a clever observation about human nature, or a useful mental model for understanding how attention works. Understood this law perfectly, who lived it completely, who demonstrated it with such power and consistency and transformative effect that 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it, still trying to understand it, still being changed by it when we're willing to really see what he was showing us. I know some of you are already preparing your defenses, your objections, your reasons why this doesn't apply to you because you're not religious, because you've been hurt by churches, because you've seen too many people use Jesus' name to judge and condemn and exclude and hurt. And I'm not here to defend the people who've twisted Jesus' message into something he never intended, who've used his name to build empires and justify cruelty and create the exact opposite of what he actually taught and lived. Set aside your preconceptions and your past experiences and your very valid reasons for being skeptical. The one you meet when you read his actual words and look at his actual life and pay attention to what he actually did instead of what people have said about him or done in his name. Principle. That's not what Jesus taught. That's actually the opposite of what Jesus taught. That's the religious system he spent his entire ministry challenging and dismantling and showing to be bankrupt, revealing one of the fundamental laws of how reality actually works. He embodied it so completely that he became the echo chamber in human form, reflecting back to everyone he met exactly what they needed to see, inviting them to choose what they would reflect back to the world. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the truth that love creates love, that grace creates grace, that forgiveness creates forgiveness, that what you give is what you get, that the universe responds to what you put into it. Not in theory, not in abstract teaching, but in concrete, specific documented ways that we can still read about and learn from 2,000 years later. Not avoidance or denial or pretending the anger wasn't real. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances, that doesn't require everyone around you to be calm before you can be calm. That comes from such a deep well inside you that nothing external can disturb it. As their potential, not as their disease, but as their divine nature. Not as their past, but as their possibility. And in seeing them that way, in reflecting back to them an image of themselves as whole and healed and worthy, he helped them become what he saw in them. Not pretending that destructive patterns weren't destructive. Not saying that choices don't have consequences, or that everything is fine just the way it is. Recognition that they were more than their worst moments, more than their biggest mistakes, more than the labels society had stuck on them. That they were part of something larger than themselves. That their existence wasn't random or meaningless or accidental, but intentional and significant and woven into a larger story that gave context and meaning to their individual struggles. Excused to arrest him and silence him and eliminate the threat he represented to their power and their system and their comfortable way of being, religious without actually being transformed. Not as a technique for winning people over or protecting himself or achieving some outcome. See, in situation after situation, where most of us would have been justified in responding with anger, with defensiveness, with retaliation, with self-protection. This is concrete, documented behavior that we can examine and learn from. By the standards of their society and their religion, she deserved punishment. We don't know what he wrote. The text doesn't tell us. Maybe it was the sins of the accusers. Maybe it was a verse from Scripture. Maybe it was just doodling, giving everyone a moment to calm down, creating space for something different to happen. He didn't say sin doesn't matter, or that there are no standards, or that everyone should just do whatever they want. He didn't pretend that actions don't have consequences. He whispered a different message into the darkness, that we're all broken. We've all failed. We've all fallen short, and none of us is in a position to condemn anyone else, because we're all standing in the same need of grace. The oldest first, the ones who'd loved long enough to know their own failures, to recognize their own need for mercy, and then the younger ones, until everyone was gone, and it was just Jesus and the woman. Judas, one of the 12 disciples, one of the inner circle, someone who'd walked with Jesus for years, who'd seen the miracles, who'd heard the teachings, who'd been trusted with the group's money. Judas sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. That's the price he put on their friendship, on their shared mission, on everything they've been building together. Judas used the symbol of love to accomplish an act of betrayal. He didn't reflect back the darkness of Judas's choice. Choice, as someone caught in his own darkness, as a person who would have to live with what he'd done, who would ultimately be destroyed by his own guilt and shame. But you always get to choose what you reflect back. And this was his reward. This was what the world gave back to someone who'd done nothing but good, responsible for his suffering, and he whispered, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing," experiencing the worst that humanity is capable of inflicting. And if he responded to hatred with hatred, to violence with violence, to darkness with darkness, then darkness wins. The cycle continues. The echo chamber fills with more of what's already destroying us. That's the example he left for anyone willing to follow it. You can whisper grace. Thank you for the echo chamber that's always listening, always responding, always giving me back what I'm willing to give. To recognizing that Jesus wasn't just a good teacher or a moral example or a historical figure, but the perfect demonstration of how to live in the echo chamber with full consciousness, with complete love, with absolute commitment to reflecting light even when surrounded by darkness. Not as one more thing you should do or have to do or need to do to be good enough. Ask him to give you the strength to choose light even when darkness feels more familiar, more comfortable, more justified. You don't need to understand all the theology or agree with everything the church has ever said or done in his name. Guide. First, find a quiet moment. Maybe when you first wake up, before the noise of the day drowns out the whisper of your soul. Maybe right before you go to sleep, when the world finally quiets down and you can hear yourself think. Maybe during your lunch break, stepping outside for 5 minutes, finding a bench or a quiet corner. I don't want to keep shouting pain into the world and getting pain back. I don't want to be trapped in my own echo chamber of darkness. Show me how to whisper hope like you did. Teach me to reflect love, even when I'm surrounded by darkness. I can't do this on my own. I've tried, and I keep failing, but I'm willing to try if you'll help me. I'm willing to learn if you'll teach me. Just honesty, just willingness, just opening yourself to the possibility that there's help available if you're willing to ask for it. Maybe it's yourself, because so many of us are our own worst enemies, our own harshest critics, reflecting nothing but condemnation inward while wondering why we feel so terrible. A benefit of the doubt when you'd normally assume the worst. You're doing it because Jesus showed you it's possible, and you're willing to try his way instead of continuing with your way that hasn't been working. Become aware of what you're saying to yourself, what you're putting into your internal echo chamber, what messages you're sending out that will inevitably come bouncing back. Pause. Thank you for the echo chamber that's always listening, always responding, always giving me back what I'm willing to give. Read it like you're reading it for the first time, like you don't already know the story, like you're genuinely curious about who this person was and what he taught and how he lived. Watch how he reflected light, even when surrounded by darkness, creating your reality instead of just experiencing it. Because you're part of the creation that God called good. Because Jesus looked at humanity at its worst, betraying him, torturing him, killing him, and still chose to whisper, "Father, forgive them." Your divine nature that's been buried under years of bitterness and disappointment and pain, but that's still there, still waiting, still capable of being resurrected if you're willing to let it. He knows what it's like to stand in darkness and have to choose whether to shout or whisper, whether to reflect the darkness back or to be the light. Let me help you choose light. So here we are at the end of Marcus's story. Thought, but you've been using that power unconsciously, creating by default instead of by design, reacting instead of choosing, letting your past determine your future instead of letting your choices determine your future. Back what you put in? This video Nod your head, say, "That's interesting." Maybe even feel moved or inspired or hopeful for a few minutes. And then go right back to shouting the same bitterness into your echo chamber that you've been shouting for years. Positive thinking before, and it didn't work, that your problems are real and can't be solved by just changing your attitude. Free will means you get to choose, even when the choice is self-destructive, even when the choice keeps you trapped, even when the choice leads to more suffering. Kindness instead of criticism, patience instead of irritation, love instead of resentment. Hope feels naive or foolish or dangerous, even when every fiber of your being wants to shout despair, because despair feels more honest, more realistic, more justified. Actually stop and consider what messages you've been sending out into the universe, what energy you've been putting into your relationships, what expectations you've been holding about how life works and what you deserve and what's possible for someone like you. Have you been shouting, "Life is unfair," or "I'll never succeed," or "It's too late for me," or "I'm not good enough," or "I'm too damaged," or "I've tried before and it didn't work, so why bother trying again"? Have you been shouting blame and resentment and bitterness and complaint and cynicism and despair? And if you have, and most of us have, at one time or another, in one way or another, to one degree or another, what's been echoing back to you? Be honest. Look at your life. Look at your relationships. Look at your circumstances. Look at the quality of your days, the texture of your experience, the flavor of your existence. It doesn't decide that some people deserve good echoes and others deserve bad ones. It just reflects, always, perfectly, without exception. The way is the message you keep putting into your echo chamber. That's a scary thought, isn't it? Because if it's true, if you really do have that much power, if your thoughts and words and expectations really do shape your reality to that degree, then you can't blame anyone else anymore. Maybe, just maybe, you've been your own worst enemy. It's less demanding to believe you're powerless. Starting with the very next thought you think, the very next word you speak, the very next choice you make about what you're going to put into your echo chamber. For hope instead of despair, for possibility instead of limitation. Are you ready to let Jesus, the master of the echo chamber, the one who whispered love in the face of hatred and forgiveness, in the face of betrayal and hope in the face of death, teach you how to live this principle with power? Tell me in the comments, what's one thing you're going to whisper into your echo chamber differently starting tomorrow? Just one thing, one shift, one new message, one different choice, one moment of courage to believe that maybe, just maybe, the echo chamber will give you back something beautiful if you're brave enough to put something beautiful into it. Write it in the comments. Make it public. Make it real. Make it a commitment instead of just a nice idea that fades as soon as you close this video. Not because the universe owes you anything. Not because positive thinking solves all problems, or gratitude pays the bills, or hope cures disease. Instead of bitterness, you have to take that first step. Hope even when despair feels more honest. To reflect light even when you're surrounded by darkness. The echo chamber is waiting. What will you whisper? If this message touched your heart, if it opened your eyes to something you needed to see, if it gave you even a tiny spark of hope that change is possible, that transformation is available, that you're not stuck, that there's a way out of the prison you've been living in, subscribe to this channel right now and activate the notifications. More invitations to step into the life you were meant to live instead of the life you've settled for. Commit to showing up for yourself every single day as we walk this journey together. Another opportunity, another moment to choose what we're going to put into our echo chambers. You've always had this power. If today's reflection helped you understand the power of the echo chamber in your own life, I'm sure you'll enjoy this other video I've selected especially for you here on the screen. Click now to continue learning how to whisper hope instead of shouting despair.